Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of GameHammer. It's the first one of 2020 and we are on a mission today. That mission is to find out which game was the best game of 1986. Now, there are some rules in how we do this. For a start, the games have to come from one of the top 3 8-bit systems. So that's the Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum, and the Amstrad CPC. I know people asked from last year's video, would we be covering the Acorn Electron, the BBC Master, and things like that? Perhaps, but not this year. We're focusing on the 3 core systems. So, how do we decide which ones are the games of the year from those systems? It's very, very simple. Each system gets one magazine, and from that magazine, we check the charts. Any game that was at the top of the charts for 2 or more months in 1986 qualifies for a contention as the greatest game on that system. So, we'll end up with a few games from each system, hopefully a few games from each system anyway. If there's only one, then, my goodness, that's a pretty good way of deciding which was the best on that system. But we'll take those games and then we'll compete them head-to-head with one another. So, all of the games that got to the top of the charts for 2 or more months from the Commodore will compete with all the other games that got to the top of the chart for 2 or more months from the Commodore. Same with the Spectrum, same with the Amstrad. One of those from each system will come out the top, and that game will be that system's contender for best game of 1986. That's the end of first round. Second round, we put all of the contenders head-to-head with one another. Which one will come out tops? That will be the best game of 1986. So, since the Commodore 64 won in the 1985 video, and we decided that Elite on Commodore 64 was the best game of 1985, we're going to start the 1986 contest by looking at the Commodore. Let's see what it's got. So we'll use one magazine for each system that we're going to be looking at, and for the Commodore 64 there can be only one choice of magazine. When you think Commodore 64 magazines, you think Zap 64. There's no contest. So let's check out which games topped the Zap 64 charts in 1986. Well, the year starts out with Summer Games 2, a game that I still can't work out why it would get to the top of the charts at all, since it's annoying and it's a joystick waggling nightmare. Perhaps 80s kids didn't mind a bit of repetitive strain injury? I don't know. Anyway, it was only at the top for 1 month because Paradroid sent it packing. Paradroid managed to hold on to the top spot for 5 months before Uridium took over, and Uridium was there for 3 months, followed by 1 month of Ghost and Goblins, then Leaderboard sat at number 1 for the final 2 months of the year. That means that we have Paradroid, Uridium, and Leaderboard all competing to be the Commodore 64's contender for Game of the Year 1986, which we'll go through. Let's take a look at all 3 of them and find out. Paradroid is the kind of game that I would have loved playing back in the 80s. It's a fun action-adventure game where you guide a droid through a spaceship, attacking other droids in order to clear the ship out and make it safe. You can interact with computers for updates and whatnot, you can take over other droids and control those, which is useful if your own droid is damaged, and there are multiple levels on the ship to explore. Everything is controlled via a simple 1-button interface on the joystick, and only the joystick. There are no keyboard controls here. Pressing the fire button without pushing the stick in any direction sets you into takeover mode, so that you can attempt to take over other droids. This also lets you interact with computers. Pushing the stick in a direction and pressing fire will shoot, which is the most common mode that you'll be using, because those other droids aren't going to blow themselves up. This is trickier than it sounds though, because the droids will move quickly and they also fire back, so watch out. Finally, you access lifts by standing on them and pressing the fire button, then pushing up or down on the joystick while the fire button is held down. This lets you select the floor that you want to go to. If all of that seems a little bit complicated and too much to remember right from the start, well, don't worry about it. You'll get the hang of it very quickly and it soon becomes almost instinctive. That is brilliant design right there. Graphically, this is nothing to write home about. The sprites work decently enough for telling you what's going on, and the screen is certainly colourful, more so than you would expect from a modern game set on a spaceship, that's for sure. The sound is also quite basic, and I wasn't a fan of the incessant hissing, but again, it's not too big a problem. So, Paradroid is a little bit basic in its sound effects, as well as its looks, and it's definitely quite blocky, but it does get the job done, and it lets you focus on the gameplay, which should always be the most important part of any game. Thankfully, there's a lot of excellent gameplay here, and I really enjoyed this one, and I can see why it got the top spot in the charts. This game is a delight, and it could easily become a personal favourite of mine for the Commodore 64. I covered Uridium in a very early episode of GameHammer, episode 6 in fact, back in 2015. This is a fantastic side-scrolling shoot-'em-up with its own unique twist on the genre. The Commodore 64 version is clearly the development version of the game, and it has a lot of lovely tweaks that the version on my beloved CPC just doesn't have, such as extra colours and faster speed. Unfortunately, the speed is what lets this version of the game down. Uridium requires lightning-fast reflexes at times, and when you're on the Commodore version, those times are more like all the time. The game is ridiculously fast, to the point where it becomes a memory test for recalling the positions of the parts of the ship that you can crash into. If you're willing to put the time in to learn the layouts on each level, then there's a lot of good fun here. But for me, I will always gravitate toward the CPC version over the C64 version, because the blistering speed on the Commodore original makes the game less enjoyable for me. Having said that, Uridium is still a fantastic game with a lot of appeal to it. If you're a shoot-'em-up fan, you'll find a lot to love with this game. I've always enjoyed a round of golf on the computer. My dad and I were big fans of Lynx Golf on the PC back in the 90s, and we still enjoy a game or two together of Tiger Woods on the Wii whenever we get the chance. So I came to Leaderboard with the hope of enjoying a decent golf game. Thankfully, that is what I got. This may not be the game that's the fastest to render the course. In fact, it's so slow that it's like watching an old text-adventure game draw and fill some vector graphics, because that really is what's going on here. The controls can also be a bit difficult to get the hang of as well, especially when you get close to the hole and start finding out that it's far easier to thwack the ball into the sea than land it where you want to. The sound effects are good, especially the sound when you finally get the ball in the hole. The game is also very colourful and very responsive when you're moving your target reticule and selecting the club that you want. So there are good points and bad points, but thankfully the good points do outweigh the bad. It isn't quite Lynx Golf, but it's not far off, and I enjoyed it. So, for our first system of the year, we have 3 solid games to choose from. Given that I'm a massive fan of Uridium, I half expected that game to walk it over the others, especially when there's yet another sports game in the mix on the Commodore. I'm happy to say that that wasn't the case in the end, however, because all 3 games turned out to be top-notch titles, and this ended up being quite a tough choice. Uridium and Paradroid ended up being the front-runners for the Commodore 64 game of choice here, but Leaderboard wasn't that far behind. They are all solid games, and they'll give immense amounts of replay value, but in the end, it's the speed and the need to memorize the layout of each part of each ship that meant that Uridium just couldn't cut it against Paradroid. When you get hit in Paradroid, you know it's because it's your fault. When you get hit in Uridium, it should be the same feeling because you were in control after all. But what it ends up actually feeling like is frustration over the fact that some parts of the spaceship are higher up than others, so you can't pass over them, but they're all the same colour, so it's not always obvious. So Paradroid has to take the prize, because its level design is far more refined. Well done, Paradroid, you go through to round 2 as the Commodore's champion for 1986. So, the Commodore 64 came along with Paradroid as its contender. That's a pretty damn good game. I really enjoyed playing that. But then again, I also enjoyed playing Uridium and Leaderboard. That was a tough choice. It really was a tough choice. However, we have got our contender for the Commodore. So, it goes through to round 2. What can we say about the ZX Spectrum that hasn't already been said? Well, I think most people would regard it as one of the greatest phenomenons in home computing ever. So many people got their start in the games industry on the ZX Spectrum. Big companies for the industry started out on the Spectrum. You had people like Rare, who started out as Ultimate Play the Game on the Spectrum. And people like that, they just built up their careers from a computer that was designed for the lowest price possible. It was the introduction system that went far more than just introducing people to home computers. But what will its game be? So, we'd best have a look at the Spectrum's contenders. Let's get into it. When it comes to the Spectrum, we have to use Crash as the magazine of record for the game's charts. There is no contest, it is the magazine for the ZX Spectrum at this point in the computer's life. So let's get straight into it. What did Crash say were the top games of 1986 on the good old Specky? Well, the year starts out strong for the Spectrum. Way of the Exploding Fist sits at the top for 2 months, closely followed by 2 months of Elite. Then Commando takes over for a whopping 4 months, before being knocked off the top spot for a month of Quasartron, but Commando isn't out of the running because it's back for another month at number 1 right after that, making it the record breaker for this year at 5 months at the top. After that, the year ends with 2 months of Ghosts and Goblins. So for the Spectrum, we have 4 contenders this year: Way of the Exploding Fist, Elite, Commando, and Ghosts and Goblins. Wow, what a set to choose from. They are all great. But only one can go through to the next round, so we better get cracking to find out which it'll be. Let's begin. We discussed The Way of the Exploding Fist in the 1985 video where we took a look at the Amstrad CPC version, so a lot of what I'm going to say about this game was covered then. It was a personal favourite game of mine when I was growing up, and my dad played it incessantly for days when he first bought it. I enjoyed the variety of moves that you could attempt, and the steadily increasing challenge from round to round was pitched just perfect to keep you coming back for more. But that was all the Amstrad CPC version. How does the Spectrum version hold up? Surprisingly well, to be honest. Okay, the background colours are a little bit garish, especially during the first few rounds of the game. That archway really sticks out and kind of pulls your attention off the characters, if I'm honest. Aside from that, plus the annoying beeper tune that just doesn't work for me, it all plays pretty well. You can still cheap move your way to victory in the early stages by waiting for your opponent to close on you and then kicking him in the balls. You can still maneuver easily and spin your character around to face the opponent by half completing a roundhouse kick, and you still have to time your moves perfectly because hit distance is still a thing, which means the game is far more strategic than some will give it credit for. This is Way of the Exploding Fist, one of the premier one-on-one tournament fighters of the 80s, and it's all present on the Spectrum. It's a fantastic game, and I love it. What can I say about Elite that I haven't already said in the Best Game of 1985 video when we covered the Commodore 64 version? To be honest, not a lot. This is Elite, the grandfather of the 3D open-world game. You can go anywhere, fight anything, do anything. The galaxy is yours for the taking, and it would not surprise me one bit if it turned out that some people bought a Spectrum just to play this game, then continued playing it right up to the modern day. It's that good. When I first encountered Elite, it was on the PC in the form of the fully shaded, no wireframe graphics here, Elite Plus. So that's the version that I always end up comparing other versions of Elite to. I know I shouldn't, I should really be focused on the wireframe original, but aside from the change in the rendering model, there's very little difference to the games, so if we can put that aside for a moment, I think we can really get into how well this port works out. I'm happy to say that Elite plays just as well on the Spectrum as it did on the PC. Okay, the graphics are pretty much monochrome, but that doesn't change the immersive gameplay and the fun that you'll have with the game when you get into it. The controls are responsive, although I did notice that I couldn't always fire while turning, which made combat a little bit more tricky than I'm used to. The default key bindings are also in a bit of a weird place, but you'll quickly get the hang of them if you check the instructions and put a bit of practice in, which is the kind of thing that you need to do for a game of this kind. It is very much like a fight simulator in space, so you've got to really get into the mindset of knowing where the keys are. The game looks great, and the wireframe graphics really work well here on the Spectrum. This is Elite. There's no doubt about it, and it's all excellently put together on the little old rubber-keyed computer. I rather enjoyed playing this one. I reviewed Commando very recently here on GameHammer, and it remains one of my all-time favourite arcade games. It was a big favourite from the early days of my CPC gaming, and I still enjoy it today. The Spectrum port of Commando is very well done. Okay, the graphics are quite basic, but they get the job done, and you can see clearly what everything is supposed to be, so I don't have a problem with them. The game runs very nicely, and the controls work very well. There's a hell of a lot to like with this one. It's fast, it's fun, and it's just a damn good game. Commando is an absolute classic both in the arcade and on the Spectrum. Everything from the arcade has been replicated here on the Spectrum, so you get the proper experience, even if it is a low-colour version. I cannot fault this one. It's fun. If you have a Spectrum, give Commando a play. I first encountered Ghosts and Goblins on the Spectrum sometime around 1988, when my cousin showed me it on his 48K Spectrum, and we had a brilliant day trying to get through the game. We never did, but we enjoyed what we did play. It was a fun game then, and it's a fun game now, even though my skills at playing it have sadly not improved. Graphically, this is a big step away from the vibrant colours of the arcade original, and the animation at the start of the game is completely lacking a background, so it's not entirely clear what's going on. I also thought there was a problem with my keyboard when I first started playing the game for this review, because it wasn't obvious that you'd start the game standing right behind a gravestone, so you needed to jump as your first action. This leads to the game's major downside. The foreground graphics are the same colour as the background graphics, which means it's not always clear what's going on or what counts as an obstacle. Now, I realise that this is because otherwise you'd have a lot of colour clash. It is a Spectrum after all, but sometimes you've just got to accept that colour clash is a necessity in order to distinguish things. Now, I will admit it won't detract from the game too much, especially once you know the levels a bit better, but it's a big stumbling block when you first start playing. Gameplay-wise, all the fun and playability of the arcade original is here on the Spectrum. It's a really fun game, with all the quirks and all the difficulties from the original staying intact during the port to the rubber-keyed 8-bit behemoth. I really enjoyed playing this one, and I can see myself coming back to it from time to time for another try as well. Wow, this was a difficult category to decide on. The Spectrum has presented us with 4 absolute classics. We have amazing, immersive, open-world gameplay in Elite. We have a fantastic one-on-one fighting game in Way of the Exploding Fist. We have 2 arcade classics in Commando and Ghosts and Goblins. So which do I choose? This is going to be a tough one, and I'm going to have to be harsh in order to make a decision. Well, the controls in Elite were just a little bit unresponsive, which meant that combat wasn't as fluid as I'd have liked it to have been in this port. Meanwhile, it wasn't always clear what was going on in Ghosts and Goblins, especially that gravestone preventing movement right at the start of the game. These are minor quibbles, but on the whole, when you have 4 absolute gems to choose from, you've got to make harsh decisions. These minor faults put these 2 top games out of the running at this time. In any other year, they would be contenders for the top prize, but the Spectrum brought its A game for 1986, so they've got to go. That leaves us with Commando and Way of the Exploding Fist. Well, I adore both games, and they are very distinct from one another, but Way of the Exploding Fist has that thing where you can spam the same move and get through to round 5 without breaking a sweat. So maybe it doesn't quite have the same gameplay and skill requirements to compete with Commando. It's still a top-class game, don't get me wrong, but Commando just edges it out by actually requiring skill right from the very start of the game. So the Spectrum's winner for 1986 has to be Commando. From 4 absolute gems of games, it manages to take the top spot by having fluid controls and needing you to actually have some skill to complete it. Well done, Commando. You go through to the next round. Wow, 4 games to contend with there. That was quite a tricky decision at the end, because the Spectrum just brings so many good games into the mix. And, wow, we had a bigger, tough choice than even with the Commodore. So, we finally got it down to Commando, but to be honest with you, pretty much any of them could have taken this top spot. It was a real hard choice, but Commando came through, and it goes through to round 2, which leaves us with our final system. And I think we all know I adore the Amstrad CPC. It was the bronze medalist, the 3rd runner. It was a system that most people like to say, oh, was it really that good? Or was it just a beefed up Spectrum with delusions of grandeur? Well, to be honest with you, it was a great system. And it had some great games. So let's have a look at what the Amstrad has to offer. The Amstrad CPC gives us more trouble this year, just like it did last year. As with Zap in 1985, Amstrad Action starts out providing charts based on readers' opinions rather than sales. This isn't actually a bad thing from our point of view, because it means that good games do still have a great chance of hitting the top spot. But the problem is, Amstrad Action didn't publish a chart in their December 1986 issue. so we only have 11 months worth of charts to play with. Oh well, we'll have to make do. What were the top-selling games in 1986 for the Amstrad CPC? Well, we begin the year in style with Sorcery, quickly followed by Way of the Exploding Fist, a game that featured heavily in the 1985 Best Game video. Then it's the turn of Yi Er Kung Fu. All three games only got 1 month each at the top, so they're automatically going to be pushed out of the running. Why? Because the rest of the year was dominated by 2 games. Elite, which spent 4 months at the top of the chart, and Get Dexter, which spent the remaining 4 months in the number 1 spot. So which will go through to the second round? Which Amstrad CPC game will be our contender in the System vs System playoffs? Let's have a look at both Elite and Get Dexter to find out. Elite passed me by in the Amstrad CPC back in the 80s. I didn't know the game existed, and when it was mentioned here and there in magazines, it didn't come across as my kind of game. Oh, how wrong I was, as my experiences on the PC would later show me. Amstrad Action even had Elite on the cover tape at one point, although it was on the issue directly after the one I stopped reading at, because I was moving away from the CPC in favour of the PC and I stopped picking up the magazines. It was like I was destined never to play this game. Well, all that has changed now because here we are. Was it worth the wait? Can my beloved CPC produce a version of Elite that stands up to all the other versions I've played over the years? As it turns out, yes. Yes, it can. This is a version of Elite that, as I recall from interviews, was either coded by or overseen by the original creators Ian Bell and David Braben, and you can see that from the start. The music is here, and it's great. It's using the CPC's multi-channel sound chip to emulate stereo sound very nicely, which really helps to draw you into the game world. The colours are vibrant, and they look fantastic too. Everything is colour-coded, so spaceships and space dock all stand out against the stars, the planets, and the lasers. This is all fantastic, and it makes understanding what is going on so much easier. The game also moves at a decent pace too, and the issue of turning while firing, or vice versa, that we saw on the Spectrum is nowhere to be found on here. This is a game that is highly polished for Amstrad's severely underrated machine, and it shows. The only downsides are that the stars don't disappear when a ship or station is in view, so it can look like the star field is actually dirt on your windscreen, which isn't great, and there are some noticeable slowdown points when there are a lot of ships in the vicinity, for example. Aside from these small quibbles, Elite on the CPC is a perfect port of the original. Now for our second Amstrad game, we have to leave the UK behind and travel across the sea to France. Those of you who are familiar with the CPC scene will know that Amstrad absolutely dominated the market in France during the CPC's lifetime, and as a result, many of the best games on the system came out of French software houses. Get Dexter is one of those games. This is an isometric view arcade adventure with a similar vein to the famous Batman, which we reviewed here on GameHammer several years ago. Unlike Batman, which was written first and foremost for the ZX Spectrum, Get Dexter is pure CPC. The code is optimized for Amstrad's take on the Z80 machine, and we can see that from the perfectly fluid gameplay, the wonderfully vibrant graphics, and the fact that the game doesn't seem to slow down whatsoever when you're playing it, for me at least. Because this is a graphic adventure game, you won't complete it on your first try. You'll probably wander around getting your bearings like I did, but when you get into it, there's a deep game here with a lot to it that will keep you coming back for more. I cannot fault this game, I really can't. I adored games like this as a kid, and if I'd ever had a chance to get my hands on Get Dexter back in the CPC's heyday, you can be sure it would have become a personal favourite. As it is, I'll just have to make up for lost time now. After the ZX Spectrum landed us with 4 contenders, the CPC has only brought us 2 to choose from. The first is an Amstrad port of one of the greatest games ever created, and the other is an arcade adventure game with visuals that show just what the CPC was capable of when put in the hands of people who actually know what they're doing with the machine. This is going to be another tough call. So, Elite is as close to a perfect port of a classic game as you're going to get. It really is. It looks wonderful, it sounds wonderful, and it mostly plays wonderfully too. The only downsides are the ones that I mentioned earlier, that the stars look like they're on top of the space stations and vehicles, while there is noticeable slowdown if there are multiple ships in the area. Get Dexter, on the other hand, is a game built for the CPC from the ground up, and it shows in every pixel. It's smooth, it's vibrant, it shows the CPC off to its full extent. As a result, I have to hand this one to Get Dexter, which goes through to round 2 as the CPC's champion for 1986. Congratulations, Get Dexter. Wow, that was a surprise. Only 2 games to contend with, which was a big surprise for me because I always remember the Amstrad as having quite a changeover of titles at its number 1 spot, but not quite at that speed. So to only have 2 games that got to the top and stayed there for more than a month, that's a surprise. But we came through. We had Elite, a classic, an absolute classic game, and Get Dexter, a classic, an absolute classic game. It was a tough decision to put Get Dexter through to the next round. So, now that we have our 3 contenders for round 2, we best put them head to head. So here we are in round 2. We began this contest with 9 games to look at, and now we've whittled it down to 3. For the Commodore 64, we have Paradroid. For the ZX Spectrum, we have Commando. And for the Amstrad CPC, we have Get Dexter. These are 3 very different games, each of which had a tough time beating the competition on their respective machines. When it comes to 1986, we really were all spoilt for choice, no matter which computer we owned. There is still the matter of choosing a winner, however, so let's get down to it. Paradroid is a wonderful, fast-paced game with a lot of hidden depth to it. There are tactics to consider, different ways to complete each level of the ship, and thus win the game. It looks pretty good, but it could have looked better. The C64 certainly could have looked better than this, we all know it. And to be honest with you, the sound on Paradroid is a letdown for the game when we reach this higher level in the contest. That buzzing really did get on my nerves, I have to admit that. Nevertheless, Paradroid is a brilliant game to play, and I highly recommend you give it a try. When it comes to the ZX Spectrum games, Commando had a very hard time beating its rivals this year. It really was the toughest category to judge. Nevertheless, we have a smooth game to play with good music, decent graphics, and brilliant gameplay. The game is immensely difficult, I'll grant you that, but it's a classic, and it replicates the whole of the arcade game's feel and gameplay. It is brilliant. Then we have Get Dexter, which was one of those games that Amstrad users could hold up as a prime example of what the humble CPC could actually do when the programmer has skills and time to get the job done properly. This is a difficult game, sure, and the isometric style isn't to everyone's liking, but it looks great, it sounds great, and it plays great. If you're into isometric adventure games, this one is tough to beat. But which one is going to be the winner? Which one will take the coveted title of GameHammer Best Game of 1986? Well, Paradroid made a strong start with its excellent gameplay, but that constant hissing sound really does start to grate on you quickly. If you add to this the drab colours and the blocky graphics, which the C64 could definitely do better at, then this is a tough one to put out there as a prime game of the year. It's really good, but it's not first place material. Paradroid takes the bronze. Commando is one of those games that I come back to time and time again, but I have to admit I don't come back to it on the Spectrum. As good as this game is, the Spectrum version is really tough, as are most incarnations of the game, I'll give you that, and I do find myself questioning whether I would favour this game over the other 2 that we have on offer here. For a quick burst of action, I would definitely load this up over Paradroid, and that's why I took the silver. But there can really only be one winner this year. There is one game that absolutely shows off the machine it's running on at its finest, and that's Get Dexter. The game is tough, sure, but that's the genre that it's in, and once you get to grips with what you're doing in the game, it becomes a fantastic adventure with a lot to see, a lot to hear, and a lot to do. It's Amstrad CPC gaming at its finest, and that's why this year, Get Dexter on the Amstrad CPC takes the gold. And there we have it. Get Dexter comes through as the number 1 game of 1986. I don't think most of us would have come into this thinking, wow, the Amstrad is going to trump this. But it did. That game, it just typifies what it means to play an Amstrad game. It's colourful, it's vibrant, it moves quick, because the Amstrad could throw the sprites around if it was coded properly. It looks great, it's presented so well, and it's just great fun. But that doesn't mean that the other contenders weren't good. This was far, far tighter a decision than I ever expected coming into this. But I think we've made the right choice. But anyway, if you pick any of those 3 contenders, or in fact, any of the games that we've talked about today, you're going to have a good day when you're playing that. So I think, in the end, everyone is a winner. But the Amstrad, it won a little bit more. Anyway, that's all we've got time for today, so thank you so much for watching. I hope you did like this, and if you did, remember to click that like button, share this with your friends so that they'll know some good games when they see them, and do subscribe for future videos because there will be more in the future. But until next time, I've been Zoe Kirk-Robinson, you've been watching GameHammer, and I'll see you tomorrow.